To capture the process of male reindeer shedding, biologist Dr. Nora Hartwell set up a camera trap in the Alaskan wilderness. But instead, she captured something she had never seen before. Her eyes widened in shock as she looked at the video and immediately knew she had made the discovery of a lifetime. While watching the video, Nora catches her breath. This creature was something no one should see. "What is this?" Dr. Nora muttered, slowly zooming in on the image. The furry animal looked strange, unlike anything she had ever seen. When she finally realized what she was looking at, she gasped. She slammed her laptop shut and quickly packed her bag. This was something her editor needed to see, and it couldn't wait. Her team flew to Alaska and stayed at the same hotel, so all she had to do was walk down the hall. There she would find her editor, but as she approached the door, she had a feeling something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar, and when Dr. Nora opened it, she saw that the room was empty, but it wasn't a quiet kind of emptiness. The room was turned upside down, with clothes strewn across the floor and documents spread out on the bed. Dr. Nora held her breath as she checked each room, hoping she wouldn't come across anyone other than her editor. Her stomach dropped when she realized no one was there and quickly went to her friend's other rooms. Every room she entered looked the same, and they were all empty. Tears began to well up in Dr. Nora's eyes as she walked back to her room, trying to make sense of the situation. As she approached the door, she heard noises coming from inside. "Where she is!" a male voice said angrily, throwing something across the room. Fearing for her life, Dr. Nora quickly backed away and fled to the stairwell. She ran down the hall as fast as she could, feeling everyone watching her. Every hooded man, everyone who made eye contact with her. Everyone seemed to be out to get her. She had to disappear, but where? She still had the laptop in her hands, but the battery was running low. She had to hunker down in the hotel for a while until it was safe to grab a few things and get out of there. She decided to go down to the basement and hide behind the washing machine for a while. Her heart pounded in her chest as she opened her laptop and downloaded all her discoveries to Google Cloud. Her hands shook as she typed. She didn't have much time. She had no idea who these men were or why they were looking for her, but she had a feeling it was all because of the creature she had discovered. The Wi-Fi connection wasn't good, but Dr. Nora managed to upload the most important files to her cloud. When she checked the time, an hour had passed, and she wondered if it would be safe for her to return. Taking a deep breath, she decided there was only one way to find out. She couldn't hide there forever. She carefully slipped up the stairs into the hall. There were no hooded men there, but she still felt like everyone was staring at her. Probably because she had just come out of the stairwell and no one walked up the stairs these days. She tried not to make eye contact with anyone and quickly entered the open elevator. When she entered the elevator, it was empty. She pressed the button to her floor, then the button to close the door, but someone reached out to keep the elevator doors open. When Dr. Nora saw who it was, her stomach dropped. It was the hooded man she had seen in the hall an hour ago. He took a seat next to her, both of them staring at the closed door in front of them. "Dr. Nora, we can do this the easy way or the hard way," the hooded man said calmly. Dr. Nora could hear her own heart beating like crazy and tried not to have a full-blown panic attack. She looked around for a way out, but she knew it was a lost cause. She held her laptop tightly as the elevator moved down again after reaching her floor, but neither of them got off. "Follow me," the man said, and walked across the hall toward the front entrance. As soon as Dr. Nora set foot on the concrete floor, she threw the laptop as hard as she could, breaking it into pieces. The hooded man slowly turned around, looking at Dr. Nora, whose body was filled with adrenaline. "Now you have no reason to stop me and my colleagues," Dr. Nora began, but the hooded man simply laughed. "Do you think I'm stupid?" he said mockingly, moving closer to her. His body moved closer to her threateningly, and Dr. Nora closed her eyes at the thought of what was about to happen. The hooded man grabbed Dr. Nora tightly and dragged her towards a nondescript van parked at the curb. As they approached, the back door opened, revealing only the shadows inside. With a rough shove, Dr. Nora fell into the cold metal interior, the remains of her laptop scattered on the pavement behind her. Before she knew it, Rough hands were pulling her deeper into the van. She felt the scratch of the blindfold that was tied tightly over her eyes. Another pair of hands secured her wrists with zip ties, securing her movements. The van's engine roared, and she felt the vehicle begin to move, every turn and bump a mystery in the darkness. "It was a stupid stunt," the hooded man's voice echoed in the tight space, tinged with mockery. Dr. Nora's heart was pounding in her chest, each beat a reminder of the danger she was facing. She remained silent, realizing the gravity of the situation she found herself in as the van sped through unfamiliar streets, her future as murky as her obscured vision. Dr. Nora's mind was racing, even as she forced herself to remain seemingly calm. She focused on the sounds outside the van, horns, distant sirens, the hum of the city blending into the quieter, rough roads. She mentally cataloged every turn, every stop, hoping it would give her a clue as to where they were going. Finally, the van's engine turned off, plunging the interior into an eerie silence. Dr. Nora's heart leapt as the door opened and hands led her outside. The air was different, cooler and tinged with the smell of disinfectant. She was led through a series of bends and then gently pushed through a door. The echo of her footsteps suggested a large, empty space. As Dr. Nora stood in an unfamiliar room, she tried to remember every detail of the creature from the recording. His unusual fur, his strange limbs, the way he moved. Everything flashed through her mind. It was a challenge to focus on these images, not knowing what awaited her next. Each memory was a piece of a puzzle she desperately needed to solve. The sound of the door closing brought Dr. Nora back to reality. The room fell silent, and she sensed that the men who had brought her here were no longer present. This moment of solitude was unsettling, but it gave her a brief, tentative sense of relief. She stood still, listening for any sign of movement outside the room. Gathering her courage, Dr. Nora reached up and removed the blindfold. Her eyes blinked in the harsh, bright light of a white-walled room, furnished only with a single bed. The room had an eerie, clinical feel, like something out of a dystopian movie. She stepped inside carefully, her hands brushing against the smooth, cold walls. As the reality of her situation sunk in, Dr. Nora began to panic. She was kidnapped, probably along with her friends, all because of a mysterious creature they were not supposed to see. She paced around the room, her mind filled with questions about their safety and whereabouts. The stark white walls seemed to close in around her, increasing her fear. Dr. Nora's frustration and fear came to a head as she pounded on the door, her voice hoarse as she screamed for help. The thick, soundproof walls muffled her screams, making them seem to be swallowed up by the room itself. Exhausted, she leaned against the door, knowing she had to wait for someone to come. She couldn't give up now. The door opened abruptly, and a tall man entered. His expression was stern as he motioned to Dr. Nora, saying only, "Please follow me." With no idea what lay ahead but desperate for answers, Dr. Nora agreed. Her heart was pounding as she followed closely behind him, exiting the stark white room and into the dimly lit hallway. The corridor seemed to go on forever, but eventually they reached another door. The man opened it, revealing a room where Dr. Nora's colleagues were gathered. Their faces lit up with relief for a moment at the sight of her, before returning to expressions of fear and confusion. As she entered, a tense atmosphere enveloped her, a mixture of relief and fear. Everyone was visibly shocked, but Sophie, the editor, looked furious. Her arms were crossed and her jaw was clenched with anger rather than fear. The others stepped back slightly as men in similar dark attire surveyed the room. The air was thick with anxiety, each colleague looking at the other for some clue as to what was happening. Sophie suddenly stepped forward, her voice loud and clear. "You have no right to keep us here. We didn't do anything wrong," she shouted to one of the men. Her tone was defiant, as if she was challenging a policeman. The man simply stared at her, unfazed. Dr. Nora looked on, feeling awe and fear at Sophie's boldness. Dr. Nora caught Sophie's eye, and she walked over and leaned closer. "They want the photo you took of that thing," she whispered urgently. Dr. Nora's eyes widened as the gravity of the situation dawned on her. The room seemed to close in around her as she realized the consequences of her actions and the danger they were in. Suddenly, it dawned on Dr. Nora that by destroying the laptop, she had inadvertently become the sole guardian of the image of the mysterious creature. This realization weighed heavily on her as she realized the crucial role she now played. The room seemed smaller and the air thicker as she realized the seriousness of her actions and the consequences for both her and her colleagues. One hooded man stepped forward, breaking the tense silence. His stern voice addressed the group. "Dr. Nora, your colleagues can leave if you give us the photo. Otherwise, they won't see daylight again." The threat hung raw and chilling as he focused on Dr. Nora. The room emptied as her colleagues left, leaving Dr. Nora alone with stern-faced men. The door closed, sealing her fate. The men stood imposingly, leaving Nora gripped by fear. One pushed the laptop toward her, gesturing for her to use it. Despite grasping her situation, Dr. Nora resisted handing over the creature's image. She stood by her laptop, hands firm, refusing to log into her Google Cloud account. "Fine," the man said coldly, grabbing her arm and dragging her to her room. He pushed her inside, slamming the door and turning the key. Dr. Nora paced, knowing her refusal hindered her team, but she believed they'd do the same. Everyone was committed, not compromising ethics. This thought strengthened her resolve as she sought escape. She dismantled the metal bed, fashioning a tool. She swung at the window, trying to break it, but it remained out of reach. Hearing keys, she readied herself, weapon in hand. As the door opened, she prepared to attack, but it was her editor, Sophie. Relieved, they fled the room, heading for what they hoped was an exit. Entering a vast room filled with crates, their relief turned to shock. Seeing hooded men, Sophie urged escape, disappearing among the crates. Left defenseless, Dr. Nora surrendered. The men led her outside to a distant barn. At the barn entrance, the lead man confronted her. "We'll show you what you captured, but then you'll give us the photo back. Delete it and leave Alaska." Dr. Nora nodded, understanding the stakes. Inside, she saw hundreds of mysterious creatures. A sharp order interrupted, demanding the door shut. A military officer approached, admonishing the hooded men. He turned to Dr. Nora, suggesting a walk. They discussed the secret project and the necessity of removing the photo. Dr. Nora complied, fearing imprisonment. After deleting the photo, they were escorted back to the hotel. The atmosphere was tense with a palpable relief. At the hotel, a hooded man issued a stern warning. "If you go to the police, don't expect help. No one will believe you." Later, they were escorted to the airport, knowing they'd never return. Back home, they moved on, their Alaska adventure fading into silence.